Good morning, everyone. It's my huge pleasure to welcome you to today's high-level meeting in the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's Road to Paris Climate Series. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 68th Secretary of State, John Kerry.
Well, good morning, everybody. Fred, thank you very, very much for a very generous introduction. I am delighted to be here with everybody, distinguished ambassadors who are here this morning. Thank you for taking time to represent your countries and come here and share your concern about this critical issue. It's clear that from Venezuela to Iraq to Ukraine, there is no shortage of energy challenges in the world today. But I have to tell you, at the top of the list of energy challenges is climate change. And that is why the Road to Paris series, the very first hosted by the Center, is so very important. And I am really delighted to be here and be a part of it. As Fred mentioned, climate change is an issue that is personal to me. And it has been since the 1980s. For decades now, the science has been screaming at us, warning us, trying to compel us to act. And I just want to underscore that. It may seem, obvious to you, but it isn't to some. Science is and has long been crystal clear when it comes to climate change. Al Gore, Tim Wirth, and a group of us organized first hearings in the Senate on this, 1988. We heard Jim Hansen sit in front of us and tell us, it's happening now, 1988. So we're not talking about news reports or blog posts or even speeches that some cabinet secretary might give at a think tank. We're talking about a fact-based, evidence-supported, peer-reviewed science. And yet, if you listen to some people in Washington or elsewhere, you'd think there's a question about whether climate change really is a problem or whether we really need to respond to it. So stop for a minute and just think about the basics. When an apple falls from a tree, it will drop toward the ground. We know that because of the basic laws of physics. Science tells us that gravity exists, and no one disputes that. Science also tells us that when the water temperature drops below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it turns to ice. No one disputes that. So when science tells us that our climate is changing and human beings are largely causing that change, by what right do people stand up and just say, well, I dispute that, or I deny that elementary truth? And yet there are those who do so. Literally a couple of days ago, I read about some state officials who are actually trying to ban the use of the term climate change in public documents because they're not willing to face the facts. Now, folks, we literally do not have the time to waste debating whether we can say climate change. We have to talk about how we solve climate change. Because no matter how much people want to bury their heads in the sand, it will not alter the fact that 97% of peer-reviewed climate studies confirm that climate change is happening and that human activity is largely responsible. I have been involved in public policy debates now for 40 plus years, since the 1960s. It is rare, I can tell you, after 28 years plus in the Senate, to get a supermajority of studies to agree on anything. But 97% over 20 plus years? That is a dramatic statement of fact that no one of good conscience has a right to ignore. But what's really troubling is that those same scientists are telling us what's going to happen. Not just the fact of it being there, but they're telling us what's coming at us. These scientists also agree that if we continue to march like robots down the path that we're on, the world as we know it will be transformed dramatically for the worse. And we can expect sea levels will continue rising to dangerous levels. We will see nations moved as a consequence in the Pacific and elsewhere. Bangladesh, countries that are low. We will see large swaths of cities and even some countries underwater. We can expect more intense and frequent extreme weather events like hurricanes and typhoons. We can expect disruptions to global agricultural sector that will threaten job security for millions of farmers and undermine food security for millions of families. We can expect prolonged droughts and resource shortages, which have the potential to fan the flames of conflict in areas that are already troubled by long-standing political, economic, religious, ideological, sectarian disputes. Imagine when they're complicated by the absence of water and food. These are the consequences of climate change. And this is the magnitude of what we are up against. And measured against the array of global threats that we face today, and there are many, terrorism, extremism, epidemics, poverty, nuclear proliferation, all challenges that respect no borders. Climate change belongs on that very same list. It is indeed one of the biggest threats facing our planet today. And even top military personnel have designated it as a security threat to not just the United States, but the world. And no one who has truly considered the science, no one who has truly listened objectively to our national security experts could reach a different conclusion. So yes, this is personal to me. But you know what? The bottom line is it ought to be personal to everybody. Every man, woman, child, business person, student, grandparent, wherever we live, whatever our calling, whatever our personal background might be, this issue affects everyone on the planet. And if any challenge requires global cooperation and urgent action, this is it. Make no mistake. This is a critical year. And that is why this Road to Paris series is so important. The science tells us we still have a window of time to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. But that window is closing quickly. We are already in a mode where we're looking at mitigation, not just prevention. In December, the world will come together at the UN Climate Conference in Paris, and we will see whether or not we can muster the collective political will to reach an ambitious, comprehensive agreement. Now, even those of us who are most involved in the negotiations, and Todd and I have talked to this and talked about it with the President, we all understand, we know that even the agreement we're trying to reach in Paris will not completely and totally be able to eliminate the threat. It's not going to. But it is an absolutely vital first step, and it would be a breakthrough demonstration that countries across the globe now recognize the problem and the need for each and every one of us to contribute to a solution. And it will set the market moving. It will change attitudes. It will change governments. And then progressively, no one can quite measure what the exponential productivity of all of that effort will produce. So we have 9 short months to come together around the kind of agreement that will put us on the right path. Now, rest assured, not a threat, but a statement of fact, if we fail, future generations will not and should not forgive those who ignore this moment, no matter their reasoning. Future generations will judge our effort not just as a policy failure, but as a collective moral failure of historic consequence. And they will want to know how world leaders could possibly have been so blind, or so ignorant, or so ideological, or so dysfunctional, and frankly so stubborn that we failed to act on knowledge that was confirmed by so many scientists in so many studies over such a long period of time and documented by so much evidence. In closing, I ask you to consider one basic question. suppose, stretching your imaginations as it will have to be, that somehow those 97% of studies that I just talked about, suppose that somehow they were wrong about climate change in the end. Hard to understand after 20 years of 97%, but imagine it. I just want you to imagine it. What are the consequences we would face for taking the actions that we're talking about? And based on the notion that those might be correct, I'll tell you what the consequences are. You'll create an extraordinary number of jobs. You'll kick our economies into gear all around the world because we'll be taking advantage of one of the biggest business opportunities the world has ever known. We'll have healthier people. Those billions of dollars of costs in the summer and at hospitals and for emphysema, lung disease, particulate cancer will be reduced because we'll be eliminating a lot of the toxic pollution coming from smokestacks and tall pipes. Air will be cleaner. You can actually see your city. We'll have a more secure world because it'll be far easier for countries to attain the long-lasting energy independence and security they need to thrive and not be blackmailed by another nation, cut off, their economy turned into turmoil because they can't have the independence they need, guarantees of energy supply. We will live up in the course of all of that to our moral responsibility to leave the planet Earth in better condition than we were handed it, to live up to even Scripture, which calls on us to protect planet Earth. All of these things are the so-called consequences of global action to address climate change. What's the other side of that question? What will happen if we do nothing? And the climate skeptics are wrong. And the delayers are wrong. And the people who calculate cost without taking everything into account are wrong. The answer to that is pretty straightforward. Utter catastrophe. Life as we know it on Earth. So I'm through my life, I've believed that you can take certain kinds of risks in the course of public affairs and life. My heroes are people who dared to take on great challenges without knowing for certain what the outcome would be. Lincoln took risks. Gandhi took risks. Churchill took risks. Dr. King took risks. Mandela took risks. But that doesn't mean that every risk taker is a role model. It's one thing to risk a career or a life on behalf of a principle or to save or liberate a population. It's quite another to wager the well-being of generations and life itself simply to continue satisfying the appetites of the present, or to insist on a course of inaction long after all the available evidence has pointed to the folly of that path. Gambling with the future of Earth itself when we know full well what the outcome would be is beyond reckless. It is just plain immoral. And it is a risk that no one should take. And we need to face reality. There is no planet B. So I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy in these next months or even these next few years. If it were, we would have solved this decades ago when the science first revealed the facts of what we were facing. But it is crunch time now. We've used up our hall passes, our excuses. We've used up too much valuable time. We know what we have to do. And I am confident that we can find a way to summon the resolve that we need to tackle this shared threat. And we can reach an agreement in Paris. We can carve out a path toward a clean energy future. We can meet this challenge. That is our charge for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. And it is a charge we must keep. Thank you all.